Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the story of John Toole and the murder of Hannah Mann, which took place in Newcastle Upon Tyne in 1908. There isn't quite as much information with this story as usual, but I hope you will still find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just also like to add, as I do often say these days, that I do record these stories live, so do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope that this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. Very little is known of the earlier life of John Toole. He was born in Hampshire in around 1884 and was said to be around 25 years old in 1908. Some newspapers do actually list him as being 35, but his trial details do say 25. His parents are unknown. He had enlisted in the Gordon Highlanders, although it is not known when, and he had been in South Africa and India. However, he had been discharged in 1906 for health reasons. Since then, he had been living with his brother-in-law in Newcastle Upon Tyne and was working as a window cleaner. Even less is known of the past life of Hannah Mann, the victim. She was said to be around 27 years old at the time of her death and was born in around 1881, and her place of birth and her parents are unknown. She was married to a Sergeant William Mann of the Yorkshire Regiment who was stationed in York. However, she had been living apart from him for around about a year, and for several months she had been living in Newcastle with John Toole. On the night of November the 3rd, 1908, Hannah Mann went to visit a neighbour by the name of Agnes Gay, who lived in Oystershell Lane in Newcastle. Agnes invited her inside, and she had been there for around 10 minutes or so when there was a knock at the door. Agnes found John Toole outside asking if Hannah was there, and so she invited him inside as well. The couple only stayed a few minutes before leaving to head to their own home, and after this Agnes went to bed. Shortly after 2:30 a.m, Agnes was awoken by someone knocking on her door. She asked who it was, and she heard a voice she knew to be John's shout, "Please come, Mrs. Gay, I have murdered Hannah." Agnes got dressed and went outside, but could see no sign of John anywhere, so she then headed in the direction of their home. When she arrived, she found the door was open. On going inside, she found the body of Hannah Mann lying in a pool of blood. Her throat had been cut. Hannah was still alive, so Agnes tried to go for help, but John grabbed her and begged her not to leave him. She told him to let her go, and she went in search of a policeman. PC Leyburn was on duty in Wellington Street when Agnes found him, and he went with her to the home of Hannah and John. Here he found John standing in the room and Hannah on the floor. Noticing that Hannah was still alive, she was later taken to the RVI, but she died here a short time after this from her injuries. PC Leyburn later arrested John Toole for the willful murder of Hannah Mann, and on the way to Westgate Police Station, John spoke of always having been a good husband to Hannah, and he said that they'd been to the pictures that night, but that she'd left him there on his own and he didn't know where she had gone. The inquest was held at the Royal Victoria Infirmary in Newcastle on November the 5th before Coroner Hoyle. Minnie Stewart, though some papers refer to her as Minnie Douglas, said that she had identified the body as being that of her sister Hannah Mann. She said Hannah was the wife of William Mann, who was currently stationed at York, but the couple had been separated for around a year. And she said that for the past 4 months, Hannah had been living in Newcastle with John Toole as man and wife, and the couple had recently moved to Hill Street. She believed her sister was not much of a drinker, and she said she had last seen her alive a few days ago. And she said it had been Mrs. Gay who had told her the day before the inquest that Hannah had died, and she had immediately gone to identify her. Agnes Gay said she was a widow and had known Hannah for about 6 or 7 weeks. Agnes was very upset and had to be given a seat before she was able to continue speaking. She said Hannah had come to her house in Oystershell Lane to deliver a parcel. She said Hannah had told her that John had a bottle of beer at home and she thought they might share it when she went back there. She said shortly after this, John knocked at the door asking for Hannah and she let him in and they all talked for a few minutes. She said the couple seemed to be on good terms and they left her home at around 11:20 p.m. and she had then gone to bed. It was at this point that Agnes fainted, and it was some time before she was able to continue with her evidence, and it was noted that she continually struggled to speak as the whole ordeal had affected her badly. She said that she was awakened at around 2:30 a.m. by someone knocking loudly on the door, and when she shouted, "Who's there?" John shouted back telling her to come quick, "I have murdered Hannah." When she got outside there was no sign of John, but she knew where the couple lived, so she went to their house. And on entering, she said she found John standing in the passage, and he looked at her and said, "Surely I am not a murderer yet." She said she pushed past him and went into the room. Hannah was lying on her back on the floor. She was covered in blood. She spoke to her and she mumbled something in reply, but Agnes said she did not know what she had said. She left the house to go for help, but John grabbed hold of her in the passage and said, "Dear God, don't leave me." She said she told him to let her go as she must go for help. She found P.C. Leyburn in Wellington Street and he returned with her. When they got back to the house, John was now in the room with Hannah. She said she bent down to see if Hannah was still alive, and it was then that she found the razor lying next to her body. She picked this up and handed it to the police officer, and she said she did not hear the police officer say anything to John. It was at this point that John spoke, saying Agnes was not telling the truth. He said she had not told them how they had all drank whiskey at her house earlier that night. Agnes was asked by the coroner if this was true, and she said it was not, as she did not keep whiskey in her house. P.C. Leyburn said he was on duty in Wellington Street just after 2:35 a.m. when the previous witness had found him. She told him of a possible murder in Hill Street. He had returned to the house with her and he saw the body of Hannah on the floor covered in blood. He said she was still alive and was taken to the Royal Victoria Infirmary, but she had soon died from her wounds. P.C. Leyburn also said that Agnes had handed him the razor she found on the floor. It was covered in blood, and he said that John immediately said, "That is my razor, that is what I have cut her throat with," and it was all through jealousy. P.C. Leyburn said John then sat on a seat and began to cry. After this, he had taken John to Westgate Police Station. On the way there, John had made the following statement. "We had been to the picture hall last night, but Hannah went away and left me. I did not know where she had gone, and I went to find her. I have always been a very good husband to her." Later, when John was charged with the willful murder of Hannah Mann, he did not make any further comment. And when asked, P.C. Leyburn said he believed John to be sober. He had not noticed any signs of drink on him. Sergeant Smith said he had attended the house in Hill Street at around 3:30 a.m. on the morning of November the 4th. He said he had examined Hannah Mann and found a large cut to the left side of her throat. Her clothes were saturated with blood. He said she was unconscious but still bleeding. He dressed the wound and sent for an ambulance to take her to hospital. He said John had spoken to say, "Is she dead, Sergeant? Oh, please save me." He did not say anything further. Sergeant Smith went on to say he had examined the room and did not find any signs of a struggle. The room to him seemed to be in good order. When he had arrived, John was in the custody of P.C. Leyburn, and there were 2 women in the house as well. John was wearing clothes that were covered in blood and his hands were also blood-stained. Very little further evidence was given at the inquest other than to suggest that the couple had argued constantly and that they had been heard by neighbours to argue on the night in question. They felt John was prone to violence towards Hannah, often without any reason at all. The coroner stated that this seemed to be a very clear case, as the prisoner had previously confessed to his crime. He had told everyone it was his razor and that he was responsible for cutting her throat. And the jury, without retiring, almost immediately returned a verdict of guilty of willful murder, and John Toole was committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for Hannah Mann, and I did not find any evidence of a headstone for her anywhere in the area. The trial took place in January of 1909 at Newcastle, although no location was given. It could be assumed that it was held at the Moot Hall. John was described at the time as being a tall, very well-built young man. When asked, he pleaded not guilty to the charge of murder in a firm, clear voice. Mrs. Johnson said she was a neighbour of John and Hannah's, and on the night of November the 3rd, she had heard the couple arguing, which went on into the early hours of November the 4th. She said she heard Hannah cry out, "Oh, Jack!" For anyone not aware, Jack was often a name used by those who were actually called John. After this, Mrs. Johnson said she heard what sounded like someone falling on the floor, and then John cry out, "Hannah, I have not done that to you." After this, she had heard John outside in the street shouting, "Will no one come and help me?" Feeling concerned, she had gone to their room and she found Hannah on the floor. She had a wound to her neck which was bleeding badly. John was not there at the time, but he returned a few moments later, followed by Mrs. Gay, and it was Mrs. Gay who later went for a policeman. She said she spoke to John and said, "My God, you have done it this time, you have killed her." And she said he simply replied by saying, "Oh, oh." When asked, she said she had frequently heard the couple argue, though she did not know what about, and she believed that John often ill-used Hannah. She did not believe that either were great drinkers and mostly found them to be sober. And she continued by saying that when the policeman asked John who had done this, he had replied saying, "I have done it, and that is the razor I used." Minnie Stewart said she was the sister of Hannah Mann. She gave mostly the same evidence as she had given previously, only adding that she had known that John had often been violent towards Hannah. Just 4 weeks before the murder, Hannah had a black eye, and she herself had seen John kick her sister in the head. And her sister had told her she had been glad that she was there at the time, as she felt John would have murdered her. When asked, she stated that John had been very sorry for kicking her sister, and that she did not know why her sister had not left him because of the violence. Dr. Phillips described the wound to Hannah's neck and said she had died just a short time after being admitted to the infirmary. Although detailed post-mortem details were not given, it was believed that she had died due to the blood loss from the wound to her throat. The defence then spoke of the state of mind of John Toole, saying that the witnesses he would call would prove that he was suffering from insanity and was not responsible for his actions on the night of the crime. Henry Goodwin said he was the brother-in-law of John Toole. He said that John had enlisted in the army under the name of John Toole. He then produced his discharge papers, stating that he had been discharged due to insanity. Henry went on to say that in December of 1906 John was given into his custody, and he said he had tried his best to look after him. However, he did seem strange to him at times, although it must be said that he did not explain what exactly he meant by strange. He said he did not feel that John had shown signs of delusion or anything similar, and that since leaving the army and coming into his care he did seem to have improved to some extent and had been able to get work as a window cleaner. Mrs. Goodwin said John was her brother. She stated that he could either be very quiet or very noisy, often singing loudly in a very strange manner. And once, when at work, a work colleague had joked with him about something, and John had not liked this, and he had left work and refused to go back. She said he could be very irritable for no reason. Lieutenant Colonel Yordi of the RAMC said he had taken care of John Toole on a hospital ship returning to England from India until he was returned into the custody of his brother-in-law, and he stated that John had been placed in the hospital suffering from delusional insanity and had been classed by the army as a dangerous lunatic. He felt that although he had improved somewhat, any kind of emotion such as jealousy could easily see a return to the delusional insanity that had led to his discharge from the army, and on recently seeing John he found him to be under the impression that someone was trying to poison him. Dr. Hardcastle of Newcastle Prison said that during his time in prison, John had shown signs of insanity. He believed that while in the exercise yard, the other prisoners were talking about him or hissing at him, which was not the case. Dr. Calcott of Cox Lodge Asylum said he had examined the prisoner while in prison, and he also believed him to be insane, and that he had most definitely been insane at the time he had committed the crime. Dr. Baumgartner said he was the police surgeon at Newcastle and had also examined the prisoner, and he believed that he was suffering from some form of delusional insanity, and he felt that he had not known what he was doing when he had attacked Hannah. When asked, he said he did not believe that John would have known that what he was doing was wrong. Several other unnamed relatives of John Toole also gave evidence as to his state of mind, and most of these spoke of him acting strangely and of irrational outbursts, some of which they said could be violent. John Toole did not give evidence on his own behalf, and although he had previously stated that he had killed Hannah due to jealousy, the reason for this jealousy was never explained. The defence stated it was for the jury to decide if John had been suffering from delusional insanity at the time he had committed the crime, and although it was very clear that no one other than John had committed the murder, had he known that what he was doing at the time was wrong. The judge, in summing up, stated that for the case to be one of willful murder, the jury must be certain that the prisoner was criminally responsible for what he had done. Did he know right from wrong at that time? And he continued by saying that they had been shown evidence of the prisoner's state of mind, but as he was not a medical man, he could not give his opinion on this. It was indeed for the jury to decide if John Toole was suffering from insanity at the time he committed the murder. The jury retired for only 15 minutes before returning the verdict of guilty of murder, but that John Toole had been insane and not responsible for his actions at the time the murder was committed. The judge then addressed John, saying that he would be sent to a criminal lunatic asylum where he would be kept for the rest of his life. John did not respond to this and was quietly led from the dock and taken back to Newcastle Prison. I did not find any further details of John Toole after this, although it is most likely that he would have been transferred to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum, and I have to say that I hope he was never released, as it does seem from the evidence given that he was suffering from an insanity that could never truly be cured. And this was, in my opinion, this was a very strange case. No information was ever given as to how or where John and Hannah first met, or whether she ever found his behaviour to be strange. No evidence was ever given as to why John was so jealous of Hannah. However, the delusional insanity would suggest he did not have to have much of a reason to act in an extreme manner. And it does seem that simply leaving him alone at the pictures was enough to make him think that she was maybe going to meet someone else. The saddest part of this story is, of course, the pointless death of Hannah Mann at such a young age, as she truly hadn't done anything wrong. But I also can't help but think that it's sad that no one thought John needed more help than just his brother-in-law to look after him. If he had got help, then perhaps none of this would have happened. Under the circumstances, it does seem that the jury had no option other than to find him insane and not responsible for his actions. But what do you think? Do you think that it was wrong that John was released from the army into the care of his brother-in-law without the option of more professional help to get better, considering they considered him to be a dangerous lunatic? Do you think the jury were right in their decision? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this very sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.